Welcome everybody today. Appreciate you joining. We're going to do the next in our series of product safety management best practices. And today we're going to talk about risk assessment. And I've got two of the world's great experts in risk assessment on the screen. Will be participating in this. And we're assuming that you know about risk assessment, you've done it, you're thinking about doing it, or you're still trying to decide whether to do it. And there are a number of interesting questions that can be raised and can be discussed, which will hopefully help you decide whether to do it, what to do, how to document it, things like that. We won't be able to get to everything that I could possibly think of asking about, but we will try. As in previous webinars, Cedric Brand Protection, formerly Stericycle, is sponsoring our series, and we want to thank Cedric very much for being our sponsor and helping us put this webinar series on. Let me introduce our speakers. I'm there in the middle. I'm the lawyer on the panel, and I get to do the doom and gloom part of the presentation here. And Bruce Main on the left is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and president of Design Safe Engineering. Bruce and I known each other for a long, long time. We've co-authored articles on risk assessment. Bruce has got wonderful books and software on risk assessment. He's devoted his life to it, so he's a perfect person to help us figure out some of these things. Don Moffett, also on the phone. Don has been doing risk assessment for decades. He teaches it a lot and written a lot of wonderful material on it. After this program is over, we will be posting material. Don's got a great document he's going to post on risk assessment. So there'll be a lot of material that will flow from this webinar that hopefully will be helpful to you. So let's get started on this. Again, I'm going to just do the initial sort of introduction and point out some of the concerns, particularly the lawyers have on risk assessment. And as we all know, we're talking product safety. That's our main goal here. But in everything in safety, it has some pluses and minuses, some advantages, some disadvantages, some risks of doing certain things. And these should be considered as you do anything in the safety area, but in particular in risk assessment. This is just a simple outline of risk assessment, and it goes to the core of how to produce a safe product. But it also goes to the core, and is one of the key questions in product liability cases. Is your product safe enough? Can you make your product safer? How safe is safe enough? These are all questions that get into a product liability case, because a plaintiff's attorney and a plaintiff's expert are going to argue that we had hazards, we had risk, we knew about it, we didn't design it out, we didn't warn about it, we didn't fix the problem, and we sold the product knowingly with a certain hazard and level of risk. That's sort of the goal of the plaintiff's side in a product liability case. Well, that's every part of a risk assessment. And by doing a risk assessment, we are identifying hazards. We're admitting that there are hazards in our product. We're admitting that they can cause problems and identify the problems. We're identifying the ways that we can make the product safer. And then we decide what we want to do. Do we want to redesign or warn or instruct or do other risk reduction methods? And then we have a final product that goes out into the marketplace. So when I talk to lawyers, both in-house lawyers and litigators about risk assessment, they kind of shake their head like, now, gee, do we really have to do this? We're just creating, potentially creating documents that are going to be very hard to explain, very hard to defend. And do we really need to do it? And the answer, of course, is absolutely, we need to do it. How are we going to determine we provided a safe product? So we have to look like we were thinking about safety, we're analyzing safety, we're making decisions, yes, we're also admitting that our product does have hazards when it goes out the door. But there's just no way around that. We have to do that. And so doing risk assessment has some risks, no pun intended, but we're going to talk about ways in which, some of the ways in which you might be able to minimize these things. One thing I wanted to point out, and I know Don and I'm sure Bruce will get into it a little bit during the presentation, is that standards compliance is not a substitute for risk assessment. Standards in most situations are a minimum. They're not a defense in a product liability case. There are some standards where I'm sure that there's that the compliance with the standard by itself is enough, but that doesn't necessarily answer the question. And there'll be some discussion about risk assessment and how you consider standards and how you decide what to do about the standard and whether you need to exceed it. That's just all part of the normal kind of process. Now, in here, we're talking about what is a hazard, the severity, the exposure, the probability, and at least in my experience, and I've been involved in risk assessment for over 40 years, it's the probability part of it that's so hard, particularly on a new product where we've never had a problem before. How do we predict the probability of something happening when it's never happened before and we've never sold the product? So there's some very difficult pieces of a risk assessment, can be, that you need to do an adequate job of predicting the future, because that's what we're really doing here. We'll also be talking about post-sale risk assessment, how that's different and what effect that has. So anyway, with that, let's move to the next slide. So once you've identified a hazard, you've identified probability, severity, exposure, what do you do about it? Well, this is a chart that I've been using for years, which merely shows that you have to identify something mathematically about it, or at least low, medium, high, if you're going to do it that way. But that doesn't really answer the question. Then the company has to decide how safe is safe enough. Is it acceptable? Certainly high severity, high likelihood. No, you're not going to sell a product with a hazard like that. But low severity, low likelihood, yeah, maybe. And do you have to do anything about it? Well, maybe, maybe not. So each company has to have their own theory about what do I do about a risk assessment once I decide. The elements of a risk assessment. So this is where, again, the lawyers get a little bit antsy, because whatever you do, if there's an accident, you can be challenged, because you're in effect admitting you could have made the product safer. So you need to explain why you didn't, and how are you going to do that? And that needs to be prepared when you're preparing your risk assessment. Okay. Before I move to the next slide, I wanted to see if Don or Bruce had anything that they wanted to jump in on either of these two slides I've just talked about here. Any comments?
Sure.
Well, go ahead.
I would point out that, our discussion of risk assessment and how to assess risk is one that sucks up a lot of oxygen in the room, but it's one of the least important ones that happen. What is really important is identifying hazards and then doing risk reduction and reducing risk to an acceptable level. And the risk score, or your risk estimation, is only the means to help guide your risk reduction efforts. So the risk assessment, the assessing risk piece, that's where the wheels come off in the discussions, but it's really not the most important piece.
Okay. Don, you got anything to add? Don't feel
I definitely agree with that. It's how you approach the hazards and address the hazards that you can, mitigate those that you can't, and understand it going forward. That I totally agree with Bruce. That's where the energy needs to be spent.
Okay. All right. Now we're going to go through a series of questions that I've had and have heard over the years. Not every question we can think of, but we'll deal with as many as we can get to here. Of course, when you're identifying hazards, and then both and the probability, one of the questions is, is the hazard foreseeable? Now this is both an engineering / safety concept, but also a legal concept. And I'll speak to it on the legal side. We don't know what's reasonably foreseeable. We don't know what's reasonably unforeseeable. Hard to know what intended use and misuse is. The courts are all over the place on some of these things. Generally speaking, as a legal matter, we're required to design our product for reasonably foreseeable use and misuse. We're not required to design it for unforeseeable use or misuse, but the courts acknowledge that basically everything is foreseeable, particularly after an accident occurs. So how do you tell a jury or a judge or the CPSC, if you have to, why some accident was caused by a use that you never that is actually a misuse and that you could never foresee? Because you can foresee anything happening, but that doesn't mean you have to do it. So one of the issues is how do you figure that out? And now, from a legal standpoint, what I get concerned about is, well, if we take a completely unforeseeable misuse, but we want to put it in our risk assessment. By putting it in the risk assessment, are we in effect admitting that it is foreseeable? And the example I always give and have had a lot of experience with over the years, and that is a fellow who used to juggle my company's chainsaw while it was running. So juggling chainsaws, is that a foreseeable misuse? Well, I have a videotape of the guy doing it. Does that make it foreseeable? I don't think so. I think that even if people are doing something, that doesn't necessarily make it foreseeable. But at some point, maybe after 2 or 3 or 4 uses, it moves from unforeseeable to foreseeable. Hard to know. Anyway, I'll stop and ask for comments from Don and Bruce on the concept of how does this figure into the risk assessment process and the analysis of what hazards you put in there.
This has been one of the questions that I have been getting for 20 years, over 20 years that I've been doing it. It is always the question I get in training courses, and there's really no good answer for it. It's at the end of the day, it comes down to a judgment call on what you consider foreseeable use or extreme misuse. And I always classify misuse under foreseeable use. The only case like the juggling chainsaw gets in my opinion, to extreme misuse. And you pretty much have to look at it and really understand the use of products. One of the best examples that I have that I can use when looking at foreseeable uses, you have to understand the environment that the product is going to be used in. If you design a game that is going to be a drinking game, now you have to consider that there will be drunk individuals using the game. And are there increased risks caused by that at-risk group? So are there scenarios that drive a misuse? And in those cases, you do have to go above and beyond to address those. But there is no black and white line in this. It's a very gray area that you have to have the discussions on and understand the hazards and see whether or not you should be managing that risk. And it comes down to a judgment call a lot of times, in my opinion.
Chris?
I would add, this is a struggling area. The Ansi B11.0 standard, it's the safety of machinery standard, which is similar to the ISO 12100 standard. The B11.0 standard does define 3 terms: intended use, reasonably foreseeable misuse, and it also addresses the intentional misuse or intentional abuse. And intended use is pretty clear. That's the use that is intended by the designer of the product. And that is contained in your instructions and your information for use. Intentional abuse is outside the scope of a risk assessment. We do not consider that you have to consider intentional misuse or intentional abuse in the risk assessments that we do. Then that gets back to the reasonably foreseeable misuse. And as Don said, that's kind of a gray area. It doesn't mean everything, but it doesn't mean nothing. So you have to apply some reasonable judgment. And what I've often done is, when you get a team together to do a risk assessment and you ask them to identify the hazards for the tasks that will be performed with the product, That group is defining what is reasonably foreseeable, including reasonably foreseeable misuse. And after the assessment is done and the product goes into the marketplace, 2 years later, if somebody gets hurt, one of the questions we'll ask is, well, was that task and hazard identified on the risk assessment? And if it wasn't, you could make an argument that use was not reasonably foreseeable to the team when they did the risk assessment. It's not bulletproof, but the plaintiff, of course, the plaintiff attorney is always going to say that whatever their person did was clearly foreseeable and it was reasonably foreseeable.
Yeah, and I would just say, again, when I speak, I'm only speaking from the lawyer's side of it, is that if you wanted to put more hazards in and it was unclear whether it was foreseeable or unforeseeable, or whether it was an extreme misuse of the product, I guess you could put it in and then just put in your risk assessment that you're not even assessing probability, because either the probability is nil, because it's never happened before, or you're not aware of it, or that it is unforeseeable. So maybe you put it in there and just say it's unforeseeable, but leave it in there. And I think about my chainsaw juggling, because I had a videotape of a guy doing it, so I've seen somebody do it. So I put it in my risk assessment and say that it's unforeseeable, or that the risk is nil, and leave it at that. And at least then in the future, you can tell a plaintiff's lawyer, well, we thought about every risk we could think of. Yeah, we were aware of one guy in the world who does this, but that doesn't make it foreseeable.
I would add
one thing that I would add on also is one of the areas that I find that helps in some of these discussions is doing an effective data analysis, be it looking at injury data, looking at consumer studies, beta testing, any sort of thing where you're collecting user information. Is if in doubt, you can use those processes in order to try to help get a better handle on whether or not it's reasonable or not, whether it's likely to happen. So.
Okay. Yeah, Bruce, you were going to say?
Well, when you do include misuses in your risk assessment, it's critically important to label them as misuses. So you clearly identify misuse of that product, so that there's no question that even though the team identified the hazard and task, that they thought of this as a misuse. Because you don't want the plaintiff to come along and say, this is not only reasonably foreseeable, it's an intended use, because that's you include it in your risk assessment.
Right. Okay. All right, let's move to the next question. And this is a related question. I mean, the first bullet there is what we've really been talking about, but then following through on that. So now we've identified the hazard. Now we got to figure out probability and severity. And in my experience, again, usually the severity is fairly clear. You can usually figure out what's going to happen to somebody if the hazard occurs. It's the probability piece of it that's always so difficult. And you guys talked about a little bit, and Don, you talked a little bit about, some of the data you can look at, but assuming that you've never sold the product before, or you've sold the product but have never had an accident, it's hard to predict probability unless your competitors are having accidents, if you can find out that information. So, but ultimately the question is, okay, where do you draw the line? Where, how high of a risk, which is risk being probability, hazard, probability, severity, exposure, how high of a risk is acceptable? So what's acceptable risk and what's unacceptable risk? Again, why don't you talk about that, which of course depends on the company and they get to make the decision. But go ahead. Bruce, why don't you start on that?
That's two little words, right? Acceptable risk. That's there's a lot that goes behind that.
Right.
And if you go into the literature, you'll see an awful lot about writing about that. I know I have written, and Ken, you've written about this as well. What do you do? Which risks do you include? Well, you certainly have to identify the tasks that people are expected to perform with a product and the hazards associated with those tasks. What do they do and how could they get hurt? Absolutely have to include those. Now, beyond that, you're stepping into misuses a bit. And how far do you carry that? Well, you need to be able to say we did the right thing. At the end of the day, our team took an honest approach. We put our good effort into it, and we identified all that we could reasonably identify, and we assessed the risk. Now, what is acceptable? That depends on what you're doing. What's acceptable in the manufacturing of steel
Don, do you have any?
Yeah, when I look at the risk and more about the hazards that exist out there, I look at it two ways. One is have an effective list of the hazards that you can go through, and then you can assess the risk of each of those hazards. But then you also have to have the effective process behind that. And the process that I stand behind is you do a data analysis, you look at the foreseeable use, and then a hazards analysis, and build that up into your risk and what your overall risk is. But to your point of risk is highly dependent on what amount of risk a company is willing to take on. Look at a simple example of trampolines. No matter how you design a trampoline, there is always a risk that someone is going to do a flip, land on their neck, and actually die from it. Injury data is consistent out there about it. And so going into a product like that, you have to understand that there is a risk of that. Now, there are ways to mitigate other risk with the product, but there are inherent risks. So that's where you really get in discussion of how much risk tolerance does a given company have, how much risk are you willing to take on, and that's going to determine whether or not you even do a product, or if you do, what are some of the potential hazards that you might be willing to sort of allow to be there and mitigate in other ways.
Now, one thing, and we don't have time to get into it in detail at all, but if you're an OEM with a finished product, you're buying components for that product. So not only are you determining risk and where to draw the line for the finished product, but also in the components that you're purchasing. So it's an interesting question of, are you requiring and reviewing risk assessments performed by your component parts suppliers? Similarly, the retailers may want to see a risk assessment, or want to identify certain things as just part of their normal process of qualifying your product to sell in their stores. So risk assessment, can be a multi-layered event. I think we're focusing a little bit more on the OEMs, but it's an interesting question about whether we review as an OEM the risk assessment performed by our suppliers, and how does their risk and what they assessed as the risk fit into the risk of the final product. So it could get very complex, and I'm sure, Bruce, since you're dealing with a lot of machinery, a lot of really complex the products that have a lot of components, what do companies do out there? Will an OEM review the risk assessment, require and review a risk assessment for component part suppliers?
Well, that goes on now, certainly. We see machine builders and machine manufacturers building their machines and doing risk assessment, and their customers, that are the machine users, more and more are asking to review the risk assessment. They want some content on the risk assessment. And we see it upstream then as well, where machine builders are looking at component suppliers, particularly if you have a more integrated system. They want risk assessments from the different subsystems. Not really seeing so much at the component level. If you buy a motor, you don't see requests to see a risk assessment for the motor, but certainly seeing more of vertical integration of the risk assessment. And the OEM, of course, is the original equipment manufacturer.
Right. Now, I've done a fair amount in the auto industry with auto components. And certainly when you're selling to a car manufacturer, they have different philosophies on what is acceptable risk. So what might be acceptable in your analysis of risk in one with your particular component may be acceptable to one car OEM and not to another. So it's not black and white ever in this area, and that's partly what the complexity provides. Okay, go ahead, Don. Yeah.
One thing, even an extension off that though, is the interaction of your product with other products, and that's where I think in Europe the General Product Safety Directive has sort of expanded that, where within their regulation they actually specify that. They talk about that one of the requirements is to look at how your product is will interact with other products when it's reasonably foreseeable for them to be used together. So I think that speaks straight to it, that even the regulations are trying to address some of those scenarios as well.
Okay. All right, very good. Let's move on to the next slide. Oops. Okay. Now, a lot of what we're talking about is pre-sale. We haven't sold the product yet. We're developing a product. But post-sale risk assessment is a well-known concept. Certainly the EU has taken that to a new level. And anytime we're having incidents, we are evaluating risk post-sale. Bruce, why don't you talk a little bit about how would a post-sale risk assessment differ from the one that is performed pre-sale, or is it really the same thing?
Well, it's the same process, but the focus is usually a little different. When you have a post-sale risk assessment, typically you're concerned about one hazard or one particular use, and you're putting a lot of effort and resources in making sure that you thoroughly analyze this issue. So it's usually a bit more focused and constrained. The pre-sale tends to be a little broader, but it's the same process you work through.
And I agree, it's exactly the same process. But to focus on differences, I'd say there's really two key areas that's different. One is your availability of data. By the time you're looking at doing a post-sale risk assessment, there might be data out there that's in your customer service area or through other information that you can tap into in order to really better understand the foreseeable uses of the product and see what's going on with it. So I think that's one difference. The other significant difference that I see is the potential impact to the company if something is found. So if you're doing a pre-sale risk assessment, you find a potential hazard, you can address the hazard, you design it out, warn around it, whatever you end up, how you mitigate that. When you're in a post-sale scenario, and if you end up uncovering something that was not uncovered in the pre-sale, now there's a lot more risk to the company. You're talking about the potential risk for recalls and the cost aspect to that. So a lot of companies that I've found, when they're looking at doing post-sale risk assessments, sometimes they're done in ways to try to provide some sort of protection around that, be it under attorney-client privileges, depending on how they're looking at it, what they're looking at. But just understand going into it, you really should have a plan of action that if something is found, how are you going to deal with that? Because there is a big ramification once you're at a post-sale part.
Yeah, and again, from the legal side, certainly post-sale risk assessment and the documentation of that is much more significant and potentially a problem. On pre-sale, I think if you're doing sort of the normal risk assessment, you're making your best judgment, your best guesses based on the data that you have, and make a reasonable decision, even if a plaintiff's attorney an expert can argue you should have done better. I think from a jury standpoint, you're going to look like you're a reasonable manufacturer who did the best you could. Post-sale is different because now the future is now. We now know that something is happening, and how we deal with it, how we analyze the risk and the decisions we make are much more critical. So while the information we're gathering is the same, the available information is much broader in post-sale because now products are out in the market. We've had a report of an incident, maybe it's a near miss, maybe it's an accident, but how do we then sit and try to figure out what's the probability of this happening again, and how far do we go doing that? That's for another webinar. We'll get into that later. But they are. I wanted to make sure everybody knows that the process is very similar. Now, some of the things we'll post on the website are from the EU post-sale risk assessment process, because that is, and Bruce and Don, maybe you know more, but that's the most detailed discussion of how you do post-sale risk assessment I've ever seen. We don't do that too much in the US. I mean, there's no guidance from the government, for example, on how exactly you do it. The CPSC just says if you have a defect which could create a substantial product hazard, and then they got a couple of factors to consider, but they don't go into real detail on how do you do a post-sale risk assessment for a consumer product in the US. But in the EU, there's a lot more detail there. So I tell people, even if you're just talking about a US post-sale risk assessment, look at the EU documentation, because that might give you some insights about how to do it and what you should consider. Don or Bruce, you got any comments on that?
I fully agree. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's an ISO standard out there that Europe uses also relative to the risk assessment. There's definitely a lot more guidance that comes out of the European documentation that is really good to look at. And you're right, in the US, there's just not really good documentation or guidance on how to do any of it.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next slide, okay. So who should be involved in both pre-sale and post-sale? And before I get to that, I'll just mention, because Don, you brought up the subject of attorney-client privilege. So I thought not too many lawyers on, I don't think, but just to point that out. Certainly when you're developing a product and you're doing a pre-sale risk assessment, I mean, you could try to do it in a way that would, where you could argue attorney-client privilege, but I wouldn't want to do that. I mean, we want to look like a careful manufacturer that cares about safety. We're trying to do the right thing. We're making our best guess. Why would I want to try to hide a document that shows that I'm a diligent manufacturer considering safety? So I don't even think you'd even want to consider that. If you could do it, I don't even think it would be upheld. So pre-sale risk assessment is not something that generally could be protected under attorney-client privilege or work product privilege. Post-sale risk assessment is different. If we've had an accident, we could have a lawsuit. I could say to the engineers, go do a risk assessment, send it to me, and then I will give legal advice to the company about whether to report to the CPSC or undertake a recall. So there's certainly a much different way in the post-sale risk assessment. Now, whether you want to try to make that attorney-client privilege or not, I don't know. But at least you want your lawyer looking at the document before it's finished to see if it is ever discovered in a lawsuit, or you have to provide it to the government, whether that's something you want to live with, and if any changes need to be made. So I'm not sure if I'd even try to do attorney-client privilege on the post-sale part of it there. But anyway, I'll stop and just turn it over to Don and Bruce to talk about some of these things and their thoughts. Well, I'll start with Don on this one here.
Yeah, so sort of looking at the first question on screen about who should be involved. One of the things to just generally comment on is if you don't have a lot of knowledge on FMEAs, that is a great place to start. Failure mode effect analysis, or DFMEAs for design failure mode effect analysis. There's hundreds of books written out there about FMEAs that you can go into and learn. And FMEA is in essence a risk assessment. Now, what you do with the information can start to vary, but when you start looking at some of the components of how to do an appropriate FMEA, who should be involved? Well, you should have people who are intimately familiar with the product to make sure that they're able to explain how it was designed, why it was designed, what the intended uses are, and things like that. You want to make sure that you have an expert of the product involved with it. But you also want to have people who have no knowledge of the product with it. You don't want to get into a group think type situation where everyone's thinking the same way because they were involved in it and they can't see the forest because of the trees. So you really want to have varying viewpoints. You want to have different experiences involved in it. I've been involved with some companies that have done amazing FMEA processes on their products, and they bring in a broad mix of people in order to get those varying inputs. So that's one of the big things that I focus on as far as who should be involved in performing them and how it should be done. As far as the documentation part, fully agree also that I've had this fight in my past where at one of the consumer product companies I was at, the desire was to, at the end of the assessment, to have a blank document that all all risk had been addressed, and every time a hazard got addressed, it would get deleted off the document. There'd be nothing on the document at the end. And I challenged that, and actually it's our outside counsel, our litigation counsel, that ended up siding with me, saying, no, you actually want to show what you have done in order to address it. Having that documentation can become key. It may not prevent a lawsuit, but it can help mitigate with damages, indicating that you don't have an effective process. Having a robust documentation can actually support that you actually are trying to do the right thing, and that can go a long way, even if you do end up making a mistake at some point. The biggest part is don't have a smoking gun. Make sure you have a process in place that if something gets identified, if something is determined as a reasonable foreseeable use and there's risk associated with that or hazard associated with it, address it in some way, address it.
Okay, Bruce, jump in on that.
Sure. I mean, in my experience, in actually performing the risk assessment, you should really limit it to no more than 6 people, perhaps 4 at best. That doesn't mean that, I agree with Don, you need different perspectives, and that you should have many people from different views help review the risk assessment and contribute to it. But actually doing the heavy lifting to get the risk assessment done should be kind of a fairly small group, and they should have familiarity with the product. If you've got your customer service, your field service people, they have some great insights. As an outside consultant, I think you should always use outside consultants on your risk assessments. No, I don't believe that. Use an outside consultant when you need one. And if you don't need one, if you've got the expertise in-house and you're comfortable with your design and your decisions and you can back them up that you've done the right thing, you don't need an outside consultant. So in terms of who's being involved, a mix of people is a great idea, but they don't have to all be involved at the same time. When you try to do a risk assessment of 12 people, that can be very hard. The training they should have a bit of a variety. Somebody needs to be familiar with the risk assessment process. You need folks that are familiar with the use of the product. And as Don said, some of those that are not familiar with the product, because their perspective on the first use in particular, they can come up with some great points that those that are very familiar with it will just skip through.
Before you go, Don, I'll throw in an extra question. Should a lawyer be part of the team that's doing a risk assessment? And I ask that because I don't want to do it. I don't think I would contribute that much. But I know several companies where they do involve the in-house lawyers have to sit through the risk assessments. And, I've asked them, why is that? Said, well, the engineers usually disagree about either the hazard or the probability or the severity or the risk reduction or whatever piece of risk assessment you're talking about. And I'm sort of there to moderate the dispute, basically, and try to get a consensus, because that's what you would like to get a consensus. We really don't want to have, a majority and minority opinion in a risk assessment. So in your experience, can lawyers help or hinder the process?
For me in general, it all depends. That'll be my standard legal answer is it depends. In my experience, yes, attorneys most of the time should not necessarily be involved, but it's actually going to be a point I was going to make about the training part. I think one of the key parts of the training has to be around how do you document a risk assessment? What are the do's and don'ts? And that's where I do think that the attorneys do play a part in, is so long as the attorneys are involved in the training of the do's and don'ts, so long as the attorney is involved in the process behind it, where if there are disputes or if there are unknowns or if there are concerns, that it gets escalated up and legal perhaps gets brought in to make determinations on acceptable risk levels or things like that. I think those are where the parts come into play. But sometimes having an attorney involved in detailed process can have a chilling effect, especially when you get into discussions around foreseeable use. But again, a lot of it depends on the attorney, their background, their knowledge, their experience in the whole process.
Bruce, you got anything to say on that?
I would agree with Don.
Okay, well, that's good enough. Okay. All right. Let's move to the next question here, and we'll take questions in a few moments here. But we'll try to get this.
Ken, you skipped one. You skipped.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a second here. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Thank you for catching that. Okay, so then, you know, in the part of the process is, and again, this is a much longer discussion than we could have here today. You're analyzing hazard, risk, probability, exposure, you come up with a risk. Well, now you got to decide what to do about it. Your risk reduction procedures can include, you know, redesign, not selling the product at all. That's, I guess, the most extreme risk reduction method is just not selling it, which does happen on occasion. Or to warn, to instruct, to add a guard, or you know, something a little bit different after you've done that. How do you? And my second point here is which really combined with the first is, you know, I've got a product. I've done a risk assessment. You know, for $100, I could redesign it. $100 per product, I could redesign it or add a safety device. But for 5 cents, I can add a warning label. And we won't get into a big discussion of the safety hierarchy, but that's really what we're talking about. So when is it acceptable to warn instead of redesign the product? You know, your scoring helps you identify the different risks from different scoring, but it doesn't really answer the question. So I'll start with Bruce on this one.
Well, again, the answer is it depends, and it depends on various things. But this is no different than what you do in design. You know, if you're going to design a system with a motor, you can buy a $100 motor or a $5 motor, and what do you get for it? So if it's expensive or difficult, I mean, I would characterize this particularly in legacy products, drawing a distinction between your past product and your new product. I mean, that is often where you get into a redesign. And you're drawing a distinction between, you know, we have older products that are out there. This is a new product. This is not an extension of the old product. So you try to draw a bright line between that, where you can put in more effort into that. And, you know, the acceptability to warn instead of redesign is just part of your hazard control hierarchy. It depends on if you can, you know, that's the fundamental of safety 101. And you know, you just have to work through that. There's no black and white answer to that.
Okay, Don?
The hierarchy that I always work off is first and foremost, design out the hazard. If you can't design it out, can you safeguard? Can you have some sort of protection around the hazard? In some rare cases, I found in like commercial settings or sometimes perhaps there's an ability to train or educate the customer, especially if you're dealing with something that gets installed by professionals. Perhaps training is an option. Warning is way down on list because when you look at the risk equation and you look at risk equals hazard times exposure, a label doesn't change the hazard. And the most effective way to manage risk is to design the hazard out to reduce the hazard. But it's not to say that labeling doesn't work. It serves a place in the hierarchy. So ultimately, it comes back to one of the original charts that you shared with the risk, the severity versus probability is on those charts. Where does your company sit? What is the risk tolerance that your company has? And that's going to determine where if the severity of the hazard coupled with the probability is up high enough, then there is no too expensive. You either do it or you don't do the product, depending on where your company sits in that risk profile. So that's where you have to spend a lot of time early on with the company is really determining what is your acceptable risk tolerance? Where do you want to be? Then when you get in these types of questions, it becomes a little bit easier to know what part of the risk hierarchy do you, the mitigation hierarchy do you have to use? It's not easy though.
Now, one thing that's always troubled me is the argument that isn't it reasonably foreseeable that people will not follow warnings and instructions? And therefore, you know, you can argue misuse, but doesn't that mean in effect that you have to design out every hazard, which of course you can't. So when you're sitting here drawing the line between you know, design out and warn, when you combine that with the foreseeability of people not following warnings, you know, again, how do you how do you feel comfortable that you've done the best you can? And yeah, we're assuming that the design is either going to destroy the usefulness of the product, and it really it's safe enough if they follow the instructions, but they may not follow the instructions. So, how do I put those two together and come out with what I think is a reasonable conclusion? Bruce, you have anything on that?
Well, you have to be able to defend your decision and demonstrate that you did the right thing. So there are instances where a warning label is the appropriate risk reduction measure, and then it's not appropriate to redesign or change the design. There's instances where the opposite is true, and you just need to be able to say, yeah, we made the right decision, and be able to support it.
Okay.
And at some level, it almost gets to the point where you have to envision yourself sitting on a witness stand being asked by a prosecutor, okay, so this hazard was there, why didn't you design it out? And if you can sit there and definitively say that the cost was prohibitive, that there was no effective way to design it out, and so therefore, because then whether it be an inherent hazard or anything like that, this was the mitigation strategy that's most effective for the product that we felt managed the risk. Feel confident in that, but know that they may try to bring a witness on that says, well, it could have been redesigned this way for this cheap. So you have to do your due diligence up front. You really have to exhaust all of your effort to, can you redesign it? Because it gets back to the point, a label does not change the hazard of the product. You're hoping to manage exposure, and that's not 100%. So know that going into it, and use warnings and labels accordingly for that when there are no other options.
Okay, I'm going to just do this next question real quick. We have a couple of questions that have come in. How do you document the process in a way that is not unnecessarily harmful? And I use the word unnecessarily in there because a risk assessment in and of itself could be harmful, in the sense that you're identifying hazards that you haven't designed out, or you've decided, or you've evaluated the probability of harm in very low, when in fact it should be much higher. So, it just gives the plaintiff's attorneys and experts a way to nitpick what your analysis is, and force you to explain where you came up with the numbers, why you made these decisions. And I think that's partly what makes litigators so concerned about them. But so how do you document it, in a way? Well, to me, you can't agonize over this. Whatever you do, if an accident happens, a lawsuit's brought, they're going to say you should have done something differently. So to go to what Bruce just said, you're defending your process, you're defending your diligence and desire to have a reasonably safe product that can actually be afforded to be purchased by consumers. So it's not overly safety, not too much safety is built into it. You can still use it. I think you've got to include the warnings and instructions in there, because there's a lot of hazards that cannot be designed out. You have to rely on warnings and instructions. So I think that the process, documenting the process and not putting, extraneous comments in there that make it look like you don't care about safety, or you're kind of flippant about it, or you're making kind of wild guesses on some of these things, can be very helpful. A company I'm aware of has an extensive process of training during the product development phase, and it includes risk assessment. And they force every member in the team to go through an extensive training program, every product development team that they sit on. And part of it includes, how do you document the process? And they understand that they will be sued. They understand they'll have to defend the process. But the justification that the company product safety manager gave me for this extensive process is that no jury will ever think we didn't care about safety. And therefore, we don't think we would ever be at risk of being awarded punitive damages. So we understand that accidents will happen, that we might be challenged on this. We'll go in there and do our best to explain the process and make it look like we are trying to provide a reasonably safe product that doesn't hurt people. And that's about the best you can do. So there'll be some information in there on documentation as part of the risk assessment process. Don or Bruce, you have anything to add to that?
No, sir.
Oh,
Okay.
well said.
All right. Well, oops. We had a question come in that I'll throw up here, and that is the risk assessment process in the EU and as part of the RAPEX reporting system, and remember this is post-sale risk assessment. The question is that acceptable in the US? And I'll answer and then see if you have any comments on it. I guess I would say it's a process. It's not official in the US. It's not an official designation. I don't believe any government agency has adopted it as an acceptable process by which you can do it, but it's kind of state of the art. It's a best practice. We don't have anything quite like that, but both Don and Bruce were not aware of it either in the US. So I'd say it is acceptable. And I suggest people look at the post-sale risk assessment process. There might be even some things in there that you can use pre-sale. But if you're doing a post-sale risk assessment and you look at that, see if you can get any insights into the process. So in that sense, I would say it is acceptable, but in an unofficial way. Any comments by Don and Bruce?
I entered mine in the chat already. So.
Okay. All right. Another question. Oops, I just see some more questions. Well, I'll deal with this one. Can we use the post-sale risk assessment to educate consumers about risk and what to do about reducing risk going forward? And I think, well, Don, I think you had something to say. Well, Bruce, I'm sorry, Bruce, you were the one who said you've pondered that question for a while, so I'll start with you.
So in the machinery world, we have requirements for the machine builder to do risk assessment, but we also have requirements from the machine user to do risk assessment. That's in the B11.0 standard, and that's pretty common these days. And the corollary with consumer products is the manufacturer does the risk assessment. Can they expect the consumer to play a role in that process and also do a risk assessment depending on the product and how they use it? It's a very interesting idea to me, one I thought about for quite some time. Never been able to figure out how to make it happen so that as a manufacturer of your product, you could have in your information for use that this is the intended use of your product. Any other use should be based on a risk assessment conducted by the user. That would be about as close as I could imagine getting to it. But it's a really kind of a cool idea that if you put out a consumer product that is intended for use in a particular way, and the consumer does something different, that they actually have some responsibility there. Okay.
Don, you have anything to add? Or?
Yeah, just, I know when we were talking about it, one of the examples that I had relative to this was the Razor scooters back many years ago. When the Razor scooter came back out and was popular, there started to be a huge increase in number of instances of head injuries and things like that. And so from a post-sale standpoint, injuries data started ticking up, CPSC got involved. But in that situation, they did, instead of recalling the product, because the product was seen as having some level of benefit, they did do an education campaign to increase the use of helmets being worn by children, warnings about riding them out into streets and things like that. There was a huge campaign that was done post-sale. And then of course, all future products then started to be either sold with helmets or at least having much more extensive education and information around that. But that was something that ended up becoming more of an industry type push with the CPSC from a post-sale standpoint. That was one good example that I saw.
Okay, next question. Can an alternative safer design from a competitor's product affect your judgment in a risk assessment? Now, I'll just throw in the legal piece of it. Absolutely. That's the state of the art. If you have that's one reason why standards are so important to be involved in and consider. But unfortunately, standards are minimums. And the reason is partly because there are some competitors who don't want to do more. And so they kind of drive down the safety and the standard to the lowest common denominator. But to the extent that a competitor has a safer product in the marketplace, safer safety device, better warnings and instructions, a different design, whatever, the plaintiff's expert is going to use that against you and ask you why you're not doing that as much. So certainly, from my standpoint, that's always part of a risk assessment, a design process, is what is everybody else doing? And again, I'm from the legal side, I'm saying you want to be as safe as or safer than any product on the market. And so that's certainly part of it. Bruce?
My answer to the question is yes.
Good answer. Don, do you have a different answer? No.
No, it's yes. I'd say there are some very rare exceptions to that. The one that comes to mind right away is the table saw issue with the technology around that. I think that is a very interesting dilemma around that. There is a device out there that can make them very safe, but it's at a huge cost. And so there are still determinations that were being made around having a cost-effective product with an inherent risk, or having a safer product that's much more expensive. And that created, it continues to this day to cause some very interesting discussions around that very topic.
And that example is a great one that shows that you can have different levels of acceptable risk for the same hazard.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'll say I'll go back to my chainsaw life experience. In 1980, there was a chainsaw standard that came out that allowed 3 different safety devices, because the competitors, different manufacturers, addressed the same hazard in 3 different ways. And the standard allowed you to pick one or the other. So there are some situations where you can have an alternative design, that your design can differ from your competitors' designs, but you can still argue it's reasonably safe. And by using the term reasonably, at least in the legal context, what that means is the jury gets to decide whether you're reasonable or not. But it doesn't mean, we're not asking for absolute safety, and you don't have to have the safest product on the market. As long as yours is reasonably safe, you can argue that, even if somebody arguably has a safer product. But yeah, I go back to cars. Small cars are not as safe as big cars. Does that mean small cars are defective and unreasonably dangerous? No. As long as your small car is safe enough, the fact that there's a bigger car, a car that has more airbags or whatever, is out on the market, doesn't mean that your product is defective because you don't have all the airbags that the bigger cars have. So there can be differences, but you just have to think about it. So it is part of your risk assessment. And how do you defend the adequacy of your design in light of the designs of your competitors' products? So that's really the answer, is you got to consider it. You've got to document why you picked this design over a design that's been adopted by competitors. And that's about the best you can do. All right, last question, and then we'll stop. Any general guidance on ensuring that risk has been adequately addressed in a product you have incomplete information on? Not sure if I understand that. Ensuring the risk of
Can I respond to that one through the chat? I mean, basically what my response was, you have to get complete information. So just saying that you don't have enough information on product, if you are going to be involved in that product from a rebranding standpoint or anything, it's your responsibility to make sure you have the complete data then. So now you may not know like existing injury claims or things like that, but you have to drop it back into the risk assessment process, get complete information, and then move forward with your decisions around that.
Okay. All right. This slide right here, you can email product safety professionals. Laden is on the screen there. Here are our email addresses if you have any questions. We're going to put the slides, a link to the webinar. So if others haven't seen it, They can see it on our website. And we'll be putting more material on risk assessment in the website. We may have a webinar next November. I'm not sure. Not this next month is what I meant, this November. But we may put it off because ICFSO's got their international symposium. So we may just do it starting again in January and read the SPSB newsletter to see what we're thinking about. And if any of you have subjects you would like to have considered for the webinar next year, please send them to that website here at the top of this slide. We'd be happy to consider any of that. And thank you for attending. Again, thank you for Sedgwick for sponsoring the webinar series. And the one takeaway, and I appreciate Don and Bruce using the term "it depends" a lot, because us lawyers get dinged for doing that all the time. So, but this is really one of those areas where it's a lot of "it depends." There's a lot of great stuff out there for you to consider. And I think partly what we're trying to do here is to, in effect, tell you how complex risk assessment can be. It's not a simple process. There's a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of good information to look at to help you do the right thing. But we don't know what doing the right thing is exactly. But I feel comfortable that if you do a good, diligent job, document it appropriately, that much more often than not, you'll never have a problem having to defend your risk assessment going forward. So I'll turn it back over to Loudon, and thank you all very much for attending today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Like Ken said, the webinar will be on the website in the next few days with corresponding slides and any other information that we have. Be on the lookout for our newsletter for our next webinar in the SPSB series. Y'all have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.